Lonely rancher saved a dying native girl, holds his hand tightly, he took her in. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Arizona plain, its light the color of tarnished brass. Samuel Ward rode slowly along the fence line, reins loose in his hand, the steady creak of saddle leather the only sound in the emptiness. Since the war, and since the sickness that took his wife and boy, silence had been his truest companion. He had learned to read the land as a man reads scripture, each broken post, each track in the dust a sign, a warning, or sometimes a prayer. Ahead, a warped shack leaned against the wind. Its door banged open and shut with a hollow clap, as though the building itself were calling out for notice. Samuel frowned. An open door in this country could invite coyotes, or worse, a stray ember carried on the wind. He nudged his horse forward, meaning only to tie it closed and move on. But as he drew near, the smell reached him first.
Not the clean rot of desert weeds, but the foul stench of old blood, damp wood, and something left too long in the heat. His gut tightened. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into dust, and pushed the door with the barrel of his rifle. The darkness inside seemed heavier than it should have been. Dust motes hung in narrow shafts of light, and somewhere a fly droned lazily. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. In the far corner, slumped against the wall, sat a young woman, Apache. Her wrists were raw from rope, her ankles bound with a fraying cord. Skin stretched too thin over bone. Her eyes were open, but lifeless, staring past him into some country beyond pain. A clay bowl lay tipped on the floor, bone dry. For a moment, Samuel did not move. The air pressed in close, thick with the smell of sickness and neglect. Then he heard it, a faint rasp of breath, shallow but present. Against all odds, she lived. Her hand clutched something small, a strip of leather worn smooth by time. When Samuel's shadow fell across her, she turned her head with effort. Black eyes met his, filled with the kind of fear that does not cry out, only waits for the end. Samuel lowered his rifle.
His voice came rough from disuse. "Do you still want to live?" There was no answer, only the slow blink of eyes that seemed older than her years. He let out a breath, slid the knife from his belt, and cut the cords. When he lifted her, her weight was no more than a child's, though the lean muscle of her shoulders told of a strength once fierce. He carried her outside into the failing light. The desert wind lifted dust around them, stinging his face. For a heartbeat he thought of leaving her, this broken soul, this burden not his to carry. But another voice, older and deeper, stirred in him. "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Samuel looked down at the woman in his arms. "Not today," he murmured, and set her gently across the saddle. With a click of his tongue, the horse started toward home. Behind them, the shack sagged in silence, a mute witness to a cruelty best left in the dust. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet, broken only by the creak of leather and the faint rattle of loose stones beneath the horse's hooves. Samuel kept one arm braced around the girl's slight frame. She did not resist, nor did she lean into him. She simply endured, as though even survival was a kind of burden. The sun had slipped behind the distant mesas by the time they reached the homestead. The cabin stood plain and weathered against the horizon, its roof patched more with prayer than with timber. Samuel swung down, lifted her once more, and carried her inside. The room was simple, a narrow bed against the wall, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars of dried beans and cornmeal. Evening light streamed through the cracks in the shutters, striping the floor in gold and shadow. He laid her gently on the bed, then pulled an old wool blanket up to her chin. Her fingers still clutched the strip of leather, knuckles white with determination that her body no longer possessed. Samuel struck flint to steel, coaxing a fire to life in the hearth. Soon the scent of smoke filled the air, masking the stench of rot that clung to her clothes. He poured cornmeal into a pot of boiling water, stirring until the thin porridge released its faint, nutty smell. Setting the bowl on the table, he pulled out a chair and sat with a cigarette between his fingers.
The room crackled with fire and silence. After a time, she stirred. With effort, she pushed herself up on trembling arms, her dark eyes never leaving him. He did not move, only watched as she reached out, grasped the bowl, and brought it to her lips. She drank in slow, careful sips, like someone tasting life again for the first time. "You're not going to die," Samuel said, his voice low, almost to himself. "At least not tonight." She set the bowl down without a word, clutching the strip of leather once more to her chest. Shadows deepened as night closed around the cabin. The wind rose, whistling faintly through the chinks in the wall. Samuel stretched out on the bench near the fire, rifle within easy reach. Across the room, the girl leaned back against the wall, her gaze fixed on the window, as though expecting danger to come with the darkness. Every sound, the cry of an owl, the creak of the rafters, made her tense. Though her legs failed her, the rest of her body was drawn tight as a bowstring, ready to flee where there was no escape. Samuel watched her silhouette, small against the wall, then spoke into the quiet. "No one's coming for your life here." The wind answered, nothing more. Hours later, when the fire burned low, Samuel woke at the sound of a dry cough. He rose, poured water into a tin cup, and offered it to her. She took it with both hands, her voice a whisper so faint he almost missed it. "Thank you." Samuel nodded once and returned to his bench. In the dark cabin, two rhythms of breath, one deep, one shallow, mingled with the crackle of the dying fire. Together, they kept the night from swallowing the place whole. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The first light of morning crept through the cabin's narrow shutters, painting the wooden walls in pale stripes. Samuel Ward was already awake. Years of war and ranch life had taught him to rise before the sun, though most mornings there had been little reason to greet the day. But this morning was different. There was another rhythm of breath in the cabin besides his own. He set a pot of water over the fire, the hiss of steam mingling with the low crackle of embers. From the shelf, he measured a small handful of cornmeal, more than he could spare, perhaps, but he did not hesitate. As the porridge thickened, he glanced toward the bed. The girl lay half-curled beneath the blanket, eyes closed, though her fingers still clutched the strip of leather as if it were her last anchor to life. When the aroma of food reached her, her lids fluttered open. Her gaze swept the room warily, landing on Samuel, then the pot. She looked like a cornered doe, weak, yet alert to every movement. "Eat," Samuel said simply. He poured the porridge into a tin bowl and set it on the table. He did not move closer, knowing the trust of the wounded must be earned in silence. For a long while she only stared. Then, with trembling arms, she pushed herself upright. The effort drew a sharp breath from her lips. Slowly, she dragged herself toward the table, each movement stiff, as though her body resisted her will. Samuel pretended not to watch, busying himself with folding his bedroll. At last she reached the chair and sat, the bowl within reach. Her hands, calloused yet frail, wrapped around it as though afraid it might vanish. She lifted it carefully, took a sip, and paused. Her throat worked to swallow. Another sip followed. Samuel allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. She was fighting. The girl's dark eyes flicked to him once more, studying the lines of his face, the scars on his hands, the gray threaded through his beard. Something in her gaze softened, not trust, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall she held around herself. "Thank you." The words came so faint he nearly missed them. Her voice was raw, unused, like dry leaves brushing together. Samuel inclined his head. No more was needed. He returned to his work. But inside he felt a shift, as if the cabin had grown less empty in that single moment. By mid-morning, her strength flagged. She leaned back against the chair, the empty bowl on the table, eyes drifting closed. Samuel watched her for a while, noting the bruises on her shins, the sores left by rope, the way her body seemed both fragile and unbroken at once. He wondered who had left her in that shack and why, but he did not ask. Questions could wait until she could stand answers. Stepping outside, he filled a bucket from the well, the cold water biting at his hands. The desert wind carried the faint cry of a hawk circling overhead. Samuel paused, looking out at the endless stretch of land, the same land that had taken so much from him. Yet now, within those 4 cabin walls, life stirred again. He carried the bucket inside and placed it near the hearth. "Water," he said, gesturing with a clean cloth. She glanced at him, then at the bucket, hesitation written plain across her face. Still, she reached for the cloth, dipped it, and pressed it to her brow. Slowly, she began to wipe away the grime, the dried blood. Each stroke revealed more of the woman beneath the ruin. Sharp cheekbones, skin weathered by sun, eyes that once had burned with fire. Samuel did not comment. He only returned to the bench, his rifle within reach, watching quietly as she reclaimed the smallest piece of herself. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dust against the shutters. Inside, for the first time in a long while, the cabin held not just survival, but the faint stirrings of hope. The following morning broke clear and sharp. The sky stretched wide and merciless above the desert plain. Samuel spent the first hours repairing a broken rail by the corral, his hammer striking in steady rhythm. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the figure inside the cabin. When he returned near midday, the girl, Nayeli, he would later learn, was awake, sitting upright in the bed. Her eyes followed him with that same guarded wariness, but there was less fear than before. She had survived another night. For a man who had buried too many, that was no small victory. Samuel set down his tools, then pulled a rough wooden frame from the corner of the shed. 2 wagon wheels, salvaged years ago, now fastened to its sides. The contraption creaked as he lifted it over the threshold and into the cabin. She looked at it with suspicion, her brow furrowing. "Try it," Samuel said simply. Nayeli shook her head, pressing her lips tight, as though unwilling to trust what she did not understand. Without another word, Samuel rolled the chair closer to the bed and held out his hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his. Her skin was warm despite her weakness, the grip surprisingly firm. He eased her into the seat. The wood groaned under the shift of weight, but it held. For a moment she sat stiff, her hands gripping the armrests. Samuel crouched beside her and pointed to the wheels. "Push." She glanced at him, then at the wheels. Her arms trembled as she pressed forward. The chair lurched clumsily, rolling only a foot before stopping. She gasped, frustration flickering across her face. "Again," Samuel said. Her jaw set. She tried once more, and this time the chair rolled farther, squeaking across the floorboards. She bit her lip, pushing harder. Sweat gathered at her temple, yet she did not stop. With each shove, the chair moved a little smoother. And then it happened. The faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the first shift in expression Samuel had seen since finding her. He leaned back, arms folded, hiding his own small satisfaction. By the time she rested, her breath came fast, chest rising and falling, but her eyes held a light that had been absent before. She touched the edge of the chair, fingers tracing the wood as if to confirm it was real. "This is yours," Samuel said, his voice low. "It'll take you where your legs can't." Her gaze lifted to his, dark and searching. She gave a single, small nod. That afternoon, he brought her out onto the porch.
The wheels rattled against the uneven boards, catching on gaps, but she persisted.
When the chair snagged in a rut, she clenched her teeth and forced it through, her arms straining, shoulders taut. Samuel stood a few paces away, saying nothing, only watching. The sun dipped lower, painting the land in copper and shadow. By the water trough, the gray horse lifted its head and stepped toward her. Nayeli stretched out her hand, palm open. The animal snorted, then lowered its muzzle, letting her fingers brush its mane. Samuel saw her then, not as the broken figure in the shack, but as someone who had clawed back a piece of freedom. That night, when they returned inside, he added another chair by the fire. She wheeled herself close, the strip of leather still resting in her lap. Yet for the first time, she set it on the table beside her instead of clutching it to her chest. Samuel said nothing. The fire cracked softly, throwing their shadows across the wall. One tall and weary, the other seated but unbowed. Two souls, no longer entirely alone. Evening shadows stretched long across the cabin floor as Samuel stacked kindling onto the fire. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carried thin and lonely across the desert. Inside, the cabin glowed warm, but the silence between them remained heavy. Nayeli sat in her chair near the hearth, the small strip of leather turning in her hands. She rubbed it with her thumb, back and forth, until the worn edges seemed almost polished by her touch. Samuel noticed. He set aside his pipe and leaned back in his chair. "What is it you hold so tight?" For a time, she said nothing, only stared into the flames. Then, with a slow breath, she lifted the pouch so he could see. It was nothing more than a narrow fold of hide, stitched with sinew, darkened by age. Yet her manner gave it weight far beyond its shape. "My father made this for me," she said at last, her voice stronger than he expected. "He told me inside are things the spirits honor, feathers, stone, herbs. It is called a protection pouch. He said as long as I keep it close, I will not walk alone." Her gaze fixed on the fire again, the words seeming to cost her something. "When the tribe left me, this was all I had. They said a cripple was better off in the ground, but I still held this. So maybe my father's words were true." Samuel studied her profile, the firelight sharpening the line of her cheek, the stubborn lift of her chin. He felt a tug of respect, not for the pouch itself, but for what it meant to her, the memory of a father's care, the echo of belonging. He rose and crossed to the narrow shelf near the bed. From it, he drew down a small, dust-covered book. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. He brushed it with his sleeve and carried it back. "This was my wife's," he said, setting the Bible on the table between them. "She used to read from it every night to me and our boy. After they passed, I couldn't bring myself to open it much." His fingers traced the faded leather, lingering on the places where her hands had once held it. Slowly, he opened to a page marked with a pressed sprig of sage, brittle now with years. He cleared his throat, the words rough but steady. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The fire popped, filling the quiet. Samuel closed the book gently and set it back on the table. Nayeli watched him with unreadable eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she nodded once, a gesture of solemn acknowledgement, not of belief, perhaps, but of respect. Two tokens lay between them, a medicine pouch and a Bible. Different worlds, different faiths, yet both carried in hands that had known loss. Samuel leaned back, and for the first time since he'd found her, the silence in the cabin felt less like distance and more like peace. The storm that had gathered through the day finally broke at dusk. Rain beat against the roof, sharp and sudden, driven sideways by the desert wind. The cabin walls shuddered under each gust, and the air inside turned damp with the smell of wet earth.
Samuel stoked the fire higher, adding another log until the flames licked bright against the gloom. He sat across from Nayeli, the Bible still resting on the table, her pouch beside it. The sound of rain filled the spaces where words might have been. At last she spoke, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Do you have a family?" The question caught him off guard. He drew in a breath, slow and heavy. "I did," he said. His voice carried the weight of years. "My wife, Anna. Our boy, Thomas. Both taken by the smallpox, back when the sickness swept through this land.
1 week I was a husband and a father. The next, I buried them on the ridge." His hands tightened on the armrests. "I sold off the herd. Couldn't bear the sound of cattle in the yard anymore. Since then, it's just been me and this cabin." The rain hammered harder, as if to underline the emptiness of his words. Nayeli's dark eyes flickered toward him, then away. Her jaw worked as though she fought against speaking, but finally the words came, low and tight. "When my legs failed after a fever, the elders said I was no longer useful. My name, Nayeli, means I am worthy. They stopped calling me that. They called me burden. Then one season, when the drought came, they left me beyond the borderland, said I should find my own way to die." Her voice cracked on the last word, though she did not weep. She sat stiff, her back against the chair, eyes hard as flint, daring him to look away. Samuel did not. His gaze held hers, steady, though his throat ached. "They were wrong," he said simply. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward. For a long time, neither spoke again. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the gaps in the shutters. Yet inside the cabin, there was only the quiet of two people who had finally bared the hollow places of their souls. Samuel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I used to think God had turned his back on me," he admitted. "Losing them, it felt like punishment, like I was the one left behind, just waiting for the ground to take me too." He looked at her, his gray eyes softer than before. "But seeing you fight, even broken as you are, it reminds me that life doesn't quit so easy. Maybe that's reason enough to keep on." Nayeli's fingers tightened around her pouch. She did not answer, but the defiance in her eyes had shifted. Not gone, but changed. Less like stone, more like a shield being lowered, inch by inch. The rain eased at last, fading to a steady patter. In its place, a fragile stillness settled, not of despair, but of survival shared. Two people, scarred by loss, yet no longer entirely alone in it. The days grew longer as spring edged toward summer. Samuel repaired fences in the yard, while Nayeli practiced wheeling her chair across the uneven ground. Each rut and stone was a challenge, yet she attacked them with the stubborn will of someone who had already been told once to give up and refused. One afternoon, a cloud of dust rose along the main road. A lone rider approached, his hat pulled low, his horse trotting at a lazy gait. Samuel, crouched near a post with hammer in hand, paused to watch. Nayeli had rolled her chair toward the woodpile, stacking split logs into neat rows. The rider slowed as he drew near, his gaze fixing on her. He reined in his horse, smirking. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Didn't think I'd see the day a rancher kept himself a crippled squaw for company." The words sliced the air, cruel and casual. Nayeli froze, the log slipping from her grasp. She lifted her chin slowly, her eyes dark as storm clouds. "Move on," she said, her voice cold and clear. The rider barked a laugh. "Feisty, ain't ya? Guess the legs don't work, but the tongue still does." The hammer in Samuel's hand stilled. He rose, tall and steady, his gray eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Without a word, he crossed the yard until he stood a few paces behind Nayeli. His rifle hung loosely over one shoulder, casual in appearance but not in intent. The rider's grin faltered. His eyes flicked from Nayeli to Samuel, then to the rifle. The silence stretched taut. "Something funny going on here?" Samuel asked, his voice calm, even. For a moment, only the horse's restless snort filled the air. The rider shifted in his saddle, spat into the dust, and tugged the reins. "Ain't worth the trouble." He kicked his horse, turning back toward the road, the sound of hooves fading into distance. Nayeli let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her shoulders eased, just slightly. She turned her head to look at Samuel. "You didn't need to step in," she said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "I didn't. Just stood behind." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not rescue, not pity, but recognition. Nayeli gripped the wheels of her chair, turned back toward the cabin, and rolled across the dirt. Samuel watched her go, then followed, his stride steady, as if the exchange with the rider had left no mark on him. But in truth, it had. The world beyond his fences had noticed her now, and words could travel faster than horses. Trouble, he knew, was coming. That evening, Nayeli sat near the fire, her pouch resting on the table. She did not clutch it as before. Her hands were steady, her gaze firm. When Samuel glanced at her, she gave him the smallest nod. It was not thanks nor surrender. It was trust. Hard-won, but real. The storm came without warning. One moment the desert sky burned gold with late sunlight, and the next it darkened, a wall of thunderclouds rolling in from the mountains. Wind howled across the plain, carrying sheets of dust that stung the skin. Samuel hurried to latch the shutters, while Nayeli wheeled herself closer to the fire, the pouch resting quietly on the table beside her. Rain hammered the roof, finding its way through cracks in the boards. A thin stream trickled down the wall, pooling on the floor before she caught it with a cloth. The room dimmed, lit only by the glow of the fire, its warmth battling the chill carried on the wind. Nayeli sat stiff, shoulders braced, eyes locked on the storm, as if expecting it to break through the walls themselves. Samuel watched her from across the hearth. "Storm can't touch you in here," he said. She gave a sharp breath, halfway between a scoff and a laugh. "You sound certain?" "Been through plenty of storms," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "They pass, same as all things." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Some storms don't pass, they stay inside." Samuel's gaze held hers. The words struck too close to his own truth. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I know that storm." Silence stretched. The rain rattled against the shutters, thunder rolling across the plain. Then, unexpectedly, Nayeli laughed, a short, soft sound that startled them both. She covered her mouth as if ashamed, but her eyes shone, lighter than he had ever seen them. Samuel felt something shift in the room, as if the weight pressing down on both of them had eased just enough to let in a breath of air. He reached for the Bible on the table, his fingers brushing the worn leather. His voice came low, almost a whisper, as he spoke words he had not read aloud in years. "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." The verse lingered in the air, mingling with the crackle of fire and the rhythm of rain. Nayeli's eyes softened, not in disbelief, but in recognition of something she understood in her own way. She turned slightly toward him, the firelight tracing the scars at her temple, the curve of her jaw. Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to turn away. She did not. His hand brushed a strand of damped black hair from her face, tucking it gently behind her ear. Their eyes met, gray and dark, weary and unyielding. The space between them narrowed, drawn by something neither could name. The kiss was not hurried. It was slow, tentative, born not of passion's fire, but of trust long starved and finally fed.
When they parted, Nayeli tilted her head slightly, her gaze no longer guarded, but warm, steady, alive. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, for the first time, the cabin did not feel like a shelter against the world's cruelty. It felt home. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. Late one afternoon, as the sun sagged low behind the red mesas, Samuel Ward was mending a water trough near the yard. The cattle moved lazily in the heat, swishing their tails at flies. For once, the day felt almost ordinary. Then came the sound he dreaded, the thunder of hooves. He straightened, squinting against the dust rising from the road. A group of riders approached, their silhouettes hard against the setting sun. At the front rode a broad-shouldered man in a bowler hat, his horse lathered with sweat. Samuel knew him well enough. Foreman Burke, head of the town council, a man whose voice carried weight in every saloon and store in the county. The riders pulled up at the gate, horses snorting, dust hanging thick in the air. Burke leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing on Samuel. "Ward," he called, his voice sharp. "We've heard talk you're harboring an Apache woman out here. That true?" Samuel set the hammer down slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "She's my guest," he said evenly. Burke barked a dry laugh. "Guest? Out here, that word doesn't mean what you think. Folks in town are restless. Cattle's gone missing near the creek, and some are saying your little companion tipped her people off." Inside the cabin, Nayeli heard the voices. She rolled her chair closer to the window, her heart thudding. Through the crack, she saw the men, faces hard, rifles slung, eyes already condemning her without trial. Samuel's gray eyes stayed fixed on Burke. She had nothing to do with that. Burke spat into the dust, letting the silence stretch. "Maybe, maybe not. But you know the law, Ward. Apaches aren't welcome on this land. You send her off before sundown, or we'll come take her ourselves." The words hung heavy, final. Samuel felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders. In another time, he might have bent to it. He might have let grief and loneliness make the decision for him. But not now. Not after the nights by the fire, the laughter that had slipped past Nayeli's guarded lips, the storm weathered together. He stepped forward, boots grinding in the dust. His hand rested on the fence rail, steady as stone. "No one touches her," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Not while I draw breath." Burke's expression hardened. He looked past Samuel, toward the cabin where he knew the woman waited. "Then you're asking for trouble. Tonight won't be quiet." With a sharp tug on the reins, Burke turned his horse. The others followed, the sound of their hooves fading into the twilight, leaving only dust and a silence thick with threat. Samuel stood at the gate long after they'd gone, the sun sinking behind him, the land swallowed by shadow. He knew, as sure as he knew the weight of his rifle, that the path ahead had narrowed to a single line. There was no turning back. Inside the cabin, Nayeli sat motionless by the window. She had heard every word. Her hands tightened on the wooden arms of the chair until her knuckles blanched. Fear ran through her like cold water. Fear of the men outside, of fire and rifles, of being dragged once more into the dust. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, quiet and unfamiliar, a fragile sense of belonging. Samuel's voice carried through the walls, low but firm. "She stays." Burke twisted in his saddle, his jaw tightening. "Ward, you've lost your senses. That woman isn't your kin. She isn't your kind. She'll bring you nothing but grief." Samuel didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the fence, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "This is my land, my cabin. She's under my roof, which makes her my guest. Cross this fence and you answer to me." The words hung in the air, taut as a drawn bowstring. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Another chuckled, though it sounded uneasy. Burke raised a hand, silencing them, his gaze never leaving Samuel. "You'd pit yourself against the whole town for her?" Burke asked, incredulous. "I'd pit myself against hell itself," Samuel said, his voice steady, "before I hand her over to men who'd see her dead." Inside, Nayeli pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest tight. The man who had found her broken and discarded now spoke as if her life had weight, as if she were not a burden, but something worth protecting. A slow warmth crept through the fear, something dangerously close to pride. Burke's face darkened. "So be it," he muttered. He turned his horse sharply, the others following. But his parting words cut the air like a whip. "Tonight, Ward, we'll settle it tonight." The riders thundered off, leaving the yard silent save for the restless shifting of cattle. Samuel stood unmoving, his hand still resting on the fence rail. When at last he turned, he saw her at the window. Their eyes met, his gray, worn by years of loss, hers dark, sharpened by both fear and defiance. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was no longer empty. Samuel stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind him. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Nayeli straightened, her voice firmer than she thought possible. "Then we will be ready." For the first time since he had carried her from the shack, Samuel felt something stir in his chest, a spark of kinship, of partnership. Whatever came with the night, they would face it together. As the last light drained from the sky, the cabin settled into uneasy quiet. Beyond the shutters, the desert stretched dark and endless, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. Samuel moved through the room with measured purpose, every action deliberate. He set the Winchester across the table, opened the chamber, and ran a cloth down the barrel. The metallic click of each piece sliding into place echoed in the small cabin like the tolling of a bell. From a wooden box, he laid out cartridges one by one, stacking them in neat rows. His hands were steady, though his jaw was tight. Nayeli watched him from her chair by the fire. Her eyes followed the movement of his hands, the shine of brass in the flickering light. At last, she wheeled herself closer. "You prepare for war," she said softly. Samuel glanced up. "They'll come tonight. Better to be ready." Her gaze dropped to the knife on the shelf, its short blade still sharp despite the years. She reached for it, running a thumb along the edge until a thin bead of red welled up. She didn't flinch. "I won't sit idle," she said, voice low but firm. "Not again." Samuel studied her, the firelight casting sharp shadows across her face. He saw no trace of the broken figure he had lifted from the shack. Instead, he saw a fighter, scarred but unyielding. Slowly, he nodded. "Then we prepare together." She took a rag and began honing the blade, with short, even strokes. The rhythmic scrape joined the sounds of Samuel's work. Two instruments in a quiet symphony of defiance. Between them on the table lay the Bible and the pouch side by side. Symbols of two worlds, both carried into a night that promised no mercy. Samuel paused, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. "They think they can break us," he murmured, half to himself.
"But I've already been broken once. A man doesn't fear the storm after he's buried his family in it." Nayeli's eyes lifted, steady and fierce. "I was left for dead, yet I live. If they come, they will find I do not die easy." For a long moment they held each other's gaze. In the silence, something bound them tighter than rope or law, the certainty that neither stood alone anymore. Samuel slid the final round into place and closed the chamber with a snap.
The sound was final, like the closing of a door. He set the rifle across his knees and leaned back. Then let them come. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of distant hoofbeats. The night had only begun. Midnight settled heavy over the land. The storm had passed, leaving the air damp, the ground dark with rain. The cabin stood silent against the plain, its lone window glowing faintly from the fire inside. Samuel sat near the door, Winchester across his lap, listening. The stillness broke with the distant rhythm of hooves. Many hooves. The sound grew louder, a rolling thunder of men and horses sweeping in from the road. Nayeli gripped the arms of her chair, her breath quickening. She wheeled herself closer to the table where cartridges lay in neat rows, her dark eyes fixed on the door. Then came the voices, rough, jeering, carried by the wind. Torches flared outside, their glow cutting through the cracks in the shutters. The cabin walls flickered with light, shadows dancing wildly across the ceiling. "Ward!" Burke's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Bring the woman out! This is your last chance!" Samuel rose, easing the rifle into his hands. He opened the door just enough to step onto the porch. The yard beyond was ablaze with firelight. At least a dozen riders circled, rifles slung, torches raised high. Samuel's voice cut through the night. "Go home, boys. There's nothing here for you." A burly man on horseback lifted his rifle skyward and fired a shot. The crack echoed across the plain. "Drag her out and we'll be done with it." Gunfire erupted. Bullets splintered the porch rail. Samuel dove behind a beam, shouldering his rifle, and fired. His shot clipped the man's hat clean from his head, sending it spinning into the dust. The riders scattered, shouting curses as they spurred their horses. Inside the cabin, Nayeli moved quickly. She slid a cartridge across the table, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. She wheeled closer to the door, reloaded a clip, and pushed it toward Samuel as he ducked back inside to chamber another round. "You're not alone," she said, her voice fierce. Samuel met her eyes, gave a curt nod, and stepped back into the fight. He fired again, his rifle's muzzle flashing in the dark. Another man toppled from his saddle, groaning. Torches swung wildly as the riders regrouped, their shouts filling the yard. The gunfight raged for minutes that felt like hours. The cabin shuddered with each impact, glass shattering as bullets tore through the shutters. Smoke thickened, mingling with the acrid tang of gunpowder. Nayeli's hands worked tirelessly, reloading, passing rounds, her knife always within reach. Samuel fought with grim resolve, every shot precise, every movement measured. He did not fight like a man defending land. He fought like a man who had finally found something worth dying for. When at last a lull fell, the torches burned low, but the riders' shouts still echoed across the yard. The battle was far from over. Samuel leaned against the porch beam, chest heaving, rifle hot in his hands. Behind him, Nayeli sat steady as stone, her dark eyes unwavering. Together, they waited for the next strike. The fight surged back to life with a crack of rifles. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, splinters flying like hornets. Samuel fired from the porch, dropping another rider, but as he ducked to reload, a round grazed his shoulder. He staggered back, heat searing through cloth and flesh. Blood soaked his sleeve in seconds. "Samuel!" Nayeli's voice cut sharp through the chaos. She wheeled forward, her hands quick and sure. With one hand she held pressure against the wound, the other tearing a strip of cloth from a blanket. "Leave it," Samuel growled, trying to lift his rifle again. "You'll bleed out," she snapped, her eyes fierce. "Hold still." For a moment, stubbornness locked them both in place. Then Samuel relented, teeth gritted against the pain, while Nayeli bound the wound tight. Her movements were steady, practiced, as if tending to wounds had been part of her life long before this night. "You're not done yet," she told him, her voice low but unyielding.
Samuel met her gaze, saw the fire burning there, and gave a single nod. He shoved the Winchester back into his hands, chambered another round, and stepped once more into the storm. Torches flared, voices shouted, the riders pressing close. Burke himself spurred his horse forward, face twisted in rage. "You think you can defy the whole town, Ward? You'll be buried with her before dawn." Samuel's reply was a gunshot, the round sparking against Burke's stirrup and sending his horse rearing. The other men hesitated, the fight faltering under the weight of Samuel's defiance. But the numbers were still against him. Shots cracked, tearing holes in the porch rail, grazing the doorframe. Samuel's body strained, his shoulder screaming with each pull of the trigger. Inside, Nayeli reloaded with furious speed, sliding fresh rounds toward him. Every time his hand reached back, hers was there, steady, supplying what he needed. Together they fought in rhythm, two against many, yet unbroken. At last, Burke raised his arm, signaling the men. His voice cut through the yard, tight with anger. "Enough! Fall back!" The riders pulled their horses away, torches scattering into the night. The sound of hooves pounded against the plain, fading like thunder rolling off into distance. Samuel leaned heavy against the porch post, breath ragged, blood seeping through the bandage. Smoke drifted in the air, mingling with the acrid sting of gunpowder. Burke's voice carried one final time, laced with venom. "This isn't over, Ward. You've chosen your side. Don't live to regret it." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness with the rest. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire inside. Samuel lowered the rifle at last, his hand trembling from pain and exhaustion. Nayeli wheeled closer, her eyes steady, her hands reaching to support him. "You kept your word," she whispered, binding the cloth tighter. Samuel met her gaze, gray eyes dimmed but unwavering. "So did you." The night fell quiet at last. No more shouts, no more hoofbeats. Only the whisper of the wind pushing smoke through the shattered shutters. Samuel slumped against the porch beam, the Winchester across his lap, his shirt dark with blood. His breath came in ragged pulls, each one sharp against his ribs. The weight of exhaustion pressed on him like stone, but he did not lower his guard until the last echo of riders faded completely into the distance. Nayeli wheeled forward, her hands firm despite their trembling. She tore another strip from the blanket and wrapped it tight around his shoulder, her movements precise, unflinching. The firelight from inside caught her face, revealing not fear but resolve. "You'll live," she said quietly, though her voice carried like a vow. Samuel let out a long breath. "I've buried too many to make promises, but tonight, yes, tonight we live." Inside, the cabin bore the scars of the fight. Bullet holes splintered through wood, a pane of glass shattered, the floor littered with spent casings. Yet the fire still burned in the hearth, steady, as if it too had chosen not to die. Samuel pushed himself upright with effort, gripping the doorframe for support. Nayeli wheeled beside him, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Their eyes met in the glow of the firelight. His gray, lined with years of sorrow. Hers dark, steady, filled with the strength of someone who had once been cast aside and yet endured. No words passed between them, but something deeper than speech bound them in that moment. Samuel lowered himself onto the bench near the fire, his body heavy with weariness. Nayeli positioned her chair beside him. Together they watched the flames lick at the logs, shadows bending across the walls like silent witnesses. At last she spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "They will come again." Samuel nodded slowly. "Maybe, but let them. I've already made my choice." Her eyes glimmered in the firelight. "And what choice is that?" He turned to her, the faintest trace of a smile breaking through the weariness. "To fight for what's worth keeping. For you. For this." For a moment, the fire popped, filling the silence. Then Nayeli reached out, laying her hand gently over his. Calloused fingers met roughened palm, and the world outside seemed to fall away. They sat there as the night deepened, two silhouettes against the glow, bound not by law or blood, but by the choice they had made together. Outside, the land stretched silent beneath the stars. Inside, though battered and blood-stained, the cabin no longer felt like a lonely outpost. It had become something else, something fragile, defiant, and enduring. It had become a home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Dawn came soft and gold across the desert, spreading light over the battered cabin. The night storm of violence had left its mark. Splintered boards, bullet holes pocked through the shutters, black scars in the dirt where torches had burned. Yet the land itself seemed strangely calm, washed clean by the first rays of the sun. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and blood, but also of life. Samuel stirred on the bench, his shoulder aching, the bandage stiff with dried crimson. He forced himself upright with a groan, testing the weight of his arm. Pain lanced through him, but it held. He was alive. By the hearth, the fire still glowed, banked low. Samuel fed it another log, listening to the small crackle. It sounded almost like a heartbeat, weak but steady. He glanced toward the table where the Bible lay beside Nayeli's pouch, two talismans of survival. The door creaked. He turned to see Nayeli wheeling herself outside. Her movements were slow, stiff with exhaustion, but determined. Through the open frame, he watched her cross the yard. She paused only once, breathing hard, then bent to lift a piece of wood. One by one, she stacked logs neatly by the wall. Samuel stepped to the doorway, leaning against the jamb. He said nothing, only watched as she worked. The morning sun painted her dark hair bronze, her shoulders glistening with sweat. Each motion carried a quiet defiance. She was proving, to him, to herself, to the ghosts of her tribe, that she was no burden. When at last she stopped, chest heaving, Samuel walked out and set the water bucket beside her. She dipped a cloth, wiped her brow, and gave him the faintest nod. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement, as if to say, "I can still carry my share." They moved together through small chores, silent but in rhythm. Samuel scattered grain for the hens. Nayeli gathered eggs with careful hands. The cattle grazed in the pasture, unbothered by the scars of the fight. Life, stubborn as desert grass, pressed forward. Later, Samuel sat at the table, the Bible open before him. His fingers brushed the pages, hesitant at first. For years it had been a reminder of loss, a relic of voices he would never hear again. But now, with Nayeli sitting nearby, it felt different, not a weight, but a guide. He cleared his throat and read aloud, his voice rough but steady. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The words of Isaiah lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke. Nayeli looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. For a long moment she was silent. Then a faint curve touched her lips, fragile but real. "Maybe your God has not forgotten us after all," she said softly. Samuel closed the book, his hands resting on its worn leather. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing the land in light. The scars of the night remained, but so did they. Two souls who had been abandoned by the world now sat across from each other, bound not by blood, but by choice, and perhaps by something greater. Samuel reached for the kettle, poured 2 cups of bitter coffee, and set one in front of Nayeli. She accepted it with steady hands. Their eyes met across the table, and for the first time in years, Samuel felt the quiet stirrings of peace. The valley stretched wide and silent beyond the cabin walls, but within, something had shifted. The morning did not belong to grief or fear anymore. It belonged to them. By afternoon, the sun blazed high, turning the yard into a shimmer of heat. Samuel leaned against the fence, his shoulder stiff beneath its bandage, watching Nayeli wheel herself across the packed earth. She stopped near the woodpile, picked up a piece of firewood, and set it neatly on a growing stack. Her movements were slower than morning, sweat streaking her brow, but her chin remained high. Samuel felt something stir deep within him, respect, sharper than any pity could ever be. She was no shadow, no burden. She was a woman who had chosen not to yield. When she caught him watching, her lips curved faintly. "I will not sit inside," she said simply. He gave a slow nod. "I wouldn't ask you to." They worked side by side through the heat, patching what they could. The fence that lined the pen had been shattered by stray bullets, boards split wide. Samuel lifted the heavier planks while Nayeli steadied nails with calloused fingers. Each strike of his hammer echoed like a promise. This land would not be abandoned, not while they still drew breath. As the hours passed, words came between the steady rhythm of work. Samuel spoke first. "Burke may come again. Town won't forgive me for standing against them." Nayeli adjusted the plank in her lap, driving a nail with precise taps. "Then let him come. I was left to die once. I will not run again." Her voice held no bitterness, only a calm strength. Samuel studied her in silence, the afternoon sun gilding the scars along her temple. He realized then how much had changed. When he first carried her into his cabin, she had been a ghost, half flesh and half spirit. Now she looked more alive than he had felt in years. He set the hammer aside, wiping sweat from his brow. "Before you came, I was already buried. I walked, I worked, but I wasn't living. You brought me back." Nayeli's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. For a long moment they said nothing, only shared the silence of 2 souls who understood the weight of loss. Then she reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was not a grand gesture, only a fleeting touch, but it was enough. Later, as the sun sank low, they sat together on the porch. The land stretched wide and scarred before them, the cabin behind them still bearing holes from the fight. Yet in the glow of evening, it all seemed changed, less a ruin, more a foundation. Samuel opened the Bible once more, his voice carrying softly into the twilight. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Romans 8:28. The verse settled between them like a steady hand, not erasing their scars, but giving them shape, meaning. Nayeli tilted her head, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. "Perhaps your God weaves even broken threads into something stronger." Samuel closed the book, his hand resting lightly over hers. "Perhaps he already has." They watched the cattle wander the pasture, dew glinting faintly on the grass as the first stars winked awake overhead. The air smelled of dust and wood smoke, but it no longer felt like loneliness. 2 figures sat in the fading light, one scarred, one wounded, both unbowed. Around them stretched a land still raw with danger, but within the cabin's worn walls they had built something harder to kill than flesh or wood. They had built a home. My friends, when we listen to stories like this, we are reminded that life on the frontier was never just about dust, gunfire, or lonely cabins. It was about people, fragile, wounded, yet unyielding, finding the courage to stand together when the world turned against them. Perhaps in Samuel and Nayeli, you can see reflections of your own journey, moments of loss, but also the quiet miracle of finding hope again. The Wild West teaches us that true love, true faith, and true Wild West stories are not written in glory, but in simple acts of kindness and the choice to keep going. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join me again. Each tale we share keeps the spirit of the old frontier alive, not just in history, but in us.